Nobody laughed in that room unless he laughed first. That's not a rule anyone wrote down. Nobody printed it on a card and slid it under the door. Nobody announced it at the entrance. But every single person who walked into that banquet hall on the 47th floor of the Obsidian Tower in Busan understood it the same way you understand not to touch fire. You just knew. The room was designed to crush people quietly. Italian marble on the floors, a chandelier that cost more than most people's entire lives, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Busan Harbor like the building itself was daring the ocean to argue. Everything in that space said the same thing in different languages. You are small, he is not. And at the center of it all sat Chairman Kang Jae-Min. He was 51 years old, black suit, no tie. A single jade ring on his right hand that he never explained and nobody ever asked about. He wasn't the tallest man in the room. He wasn't the loudest. He barely moved between courses. But every conversation in that hall happened at a volume he could have interrupted if he wanted. That's what real power looks like. Not shouting, not threatening, not waving weapons. Just the quiet certainty that every single person in the room is already thinking about you before you open your mouth. People called him different things depending on how close they were to him. Business reporters called him a self-made industrialist. Shipping companies called him a strategic partner. Politicians called him a generous donor with excellent timing. The police called him untouchable in private and respectable in public. But the people who actually lived in the underworld, the ones who moved money through walls and whispered names across encrypted phones, they called him something different. They called him the architect of silence. Because when Kang Jae-Min decided someone was a problem, the problem didn't fight, it didn't run. It simply stopped existing. Quietly, efficiently, without a single raised voice or messy scene. Tonight's gathering was supposed to be routine. 12 executives, 4 government brokers, 2 shipping magnates from Incheon who needed his blessing before they could expand their routes. Wine that cost more per bottle than a month's rent in most Korean cities. Everyone playing their part, everyone smiling the correct smile, and then, the moment that nobody planned. And the moment that would be whispered about for years in every corner of that world. It didn't come from a rival, didn't come from a betrayal, didn't come from one of the sharp-suited men who spent their days calculating how to get closer to his power without getting close enough to burn. It came from the service corridor at the far edge of the hall, specifically from a 6-year-old girl, tiny, round-faced, curly hair pressed into 2 uneven puffs on top of her head, wearing a pair of oversized pink glasses with absolutely no lenses in them because she believed they made her look important. She was holding her mother's hand, standing perfectly still, and staring directly at Kang Jae-Min with the kind of focused, unafraid attention that most grown men in that room had spent years learning how to avoid. When the bodyguards hadn't noticed her yet, the executives were still talking, the chandelier was still glowing. Everything was exactly as it should be, for exactly 4 more minutes. Her name was Lumi Adiz. And the first thing you needed to understand about Lumi was that she had never once in her 6 years of life encountered a situation she believed was not her business. A stranger crying on a bus, her business. A dog tied to a pole in the rain, absolutely her business. A powerful man sitting at the center of a room full of frightened adults, extremely her business. She hadn't wanted to come tonight, not because she was scared. Lumi didn't do scared the way other children did. She'd skipped that setting somewhere between age 4 and 5 and replaced it with a burning need to understand everything she saw. Once she hadn't wanted to come because she'd been in the middle of a very important project involving 14 crayons, a cardboard box, and her plan to build a house for the gecko she'd found behind their apartment building and named Biscuit. But her mother needed to cover an extra shift, so here she was. Her mother's name was Sola Adiz, 30 years old, immigrant, single parent. She worked as a cleaner in this building 3 evenings a week. Tonight an emergency had pulled one of the banquet service staff, and Sola had been asked to stay late to help maintain the hall during the gathering. She'd had no choice but to bring Lumi. 5 minutes, Sola had whispered before they entered. We stand near the corridor. We don't touch anything. We don't speak to anyone. And we do not, she had looked directly into her daughter's eyes, make a single scene. Lumi had nodded in a way that technically meant yes, but spiritually meant I will try my best and cannot guarantee outcomes. Now she stood beside her mother and looked at the room. She noticed things immediately. The way nobody made eye contact with the man in the center chair. The way the laughter around the tables had a tight, careful quality to it, like people laughing because they'd calculated it was safe to laugh, not because anything was actually funny. The way the bodyguards near the windows watched every movement in the hall without looking like they were watching. Lumi had a word for rooms like this. She called them sharp rooms. Rooms where the air had edges. She pressed closer to her mother without saying anything. Masola stroked her hair once. A small reassurance. We'll be quick, we'll be fine. And for a while it seemed true. The executives talked. The wine was poured. The man in the center chair listened more than he spoke, which Lumi found interesting because in her experience, the most powerful person in a room was usually the loudest one. She was filing this observation away carefully when it happened. A sound cut through the careful hum of the hall. Laughter, not the tight, calculated kind, the ugly kind. The kind that doesn't care who hears it because the person laughing has never once in their life been told to stop. Lumi turned toward the sound, a large man near the center tables, red-faced, suit slightly too tight, glass raised, leaning toward his companions with the satisfied look of someone who had just said something they found very funny. Lumi followed his gaze. It landed on her mother. She looked at her mother. Sola's face had gone very still, the kind of still that wasn't calm, the kind that was holding something in. Lumi looked back at the man. He was still laughing, and the sharp room got sharper. His name was Director Hwang Dae-seok. He was 54 years old, third-generation wealth, owned a logistics company that moved cargo through 4 Korean ports, and had never once in his life experienced a consequence for anything he said. That is the most dangerous kind of person. Not the one who is cruel because they are broken, not the one who is cruel because they are afraid, but the one who is cruel because nothing has ever stopped them, because every single time they've said something cutting or humiliating or ugly, the people around them have laughed or looked away or swallowed it quietly. Hwang Dae-seok had been laughing and looking away and making others swallow things for 30 years. Tonight he was 3 glasses of whiskey deep and feeling untouchable. He glanced toward the service corridor, toward Sola and Lumi standing near the wall. His eyes moved across Sola slowly, the way some men look at women they've already decided to disrespect. He leaned toward the man beside him. "Look at that!" His voice was just loud enough. That specific volume men like him use when they want an audience but want to pretend they don't. When even the cleaning staff gets bigger every year. A few nervous chuckles from his immediate circle. He swirled his glass. "Honestly, if she gets any heavier, the elevator might start charging her twice." More laughter, looser this time, feeding off his confidence. He shook his head with the theatrical sadness of a man who found the world perpetually disappointing. "Ugly, too. You'd think they'd at least hire presentable." He didn't finish the sentence, because something happened, a sound, small, high, furious, like a blade dropped on marble. "Did you just call my mom fat and ugly?" The room didn't go quiet. Quiet is gradual. Quiet fades in. This was instant, total, like someone had cut every wire in the building simultaneously. Every fork stopped mid-air. Every glass stopped mid-lift. Every carefully constructed conversation died in the throat of every person who'd been having it. And every eye in the banquet hall moved toward one spot. A 6-year-old girl standing alone in the center of the marble floor. Lensless glasses, clenched fists, chest heaving. Her mother 2 steps behind her, hand outstretched, face completely drained of color. "Lumi!" But Lumi wasn't listening. She was looking at Hwang Dae-seok with an expression that had no business being on a 6-year-old's face. It wasn't childish rage. It was something older, something that understood exactly what had just happened and had decided, without calculation, without fear, without any thought about consequence, that it was not acceptable. The bodyguards looked at Kang Jae-Min. Kang Jae-Min had not moved. His teacup was still raised halfway to his mouth. His eyes were on the child. And in that moment, in that terrible suspended silence, every person in that room understood that the most dangerous variable in the building was no longer the man in the center chair. It was the 6-year-old girl who had just done what none of them had ever dared. She had made a scene in his room. 3 seconds passed, long seconds, the kind that stretch. Kang Jae-Min placed his teacup on the table. The sound it made, that single soft click of porcelain on linen, moved through the silence like a stone dropped in still water. Every bodyguard in the room straightened at once, not because he gave a signal, because they knew that sound, that specific, careful sound of him deciding something. He rose from his chair, 6 feet of perfectly pressed black suit. No expression, no urgency. Just a man standing up at a dinner, which should have been ordinary, but was somehow the most frightening thing anyone in that hall had ever watched happen. His gaze moved across the room, slowly, and stopped on Lumi. She hadn't moved. This is the part that nobody who was in that room would ever be able to fully explain afterward. Not to their wives, not to their business partners, not to themselves at 3 in the morning when the memory surfaced again. The child didn't run. Every instinct in the building said, run. Every adult in that space who understood who this man was and what this moment meant had already, in their minds, begun backing away, calculating exits, reviewing their own behavior over the past hour to make sure they hadn't done anything to pull attention toward themselves. But Lumi Adiz crossed her arms and waited. Kang Jae-Min began walking toward her. The bodyguards moved with him, flanking slightly. The practiced choreography of men who had done this walk before, under very different circumstances. Sola's hand found her daughter's shoulder and gripped it, a desperate, shaking grip. Lumi, please. He needs to answer, Lumi said. Not loudly, not defiantly, just factually, the way you'd tell someone that the light is red. Kang Jae-Min stopped, 3 feet away. He looked down at her, and the entire banquet hall, 12 executives, 4 political brokers, 2 shipping magnates, 8 bodyguards, and a collection of servers frozen mid-pour, collectively held its breath. Because they had seen men beg in front of this man. Grown men, powerful men. Men with armies and resources and lawyers who had still ended up folding completely under that gaze. And this child was looking back at him like she was waiting for him to explain himself, like he was the one who needed to account for his behavior. Kang Jae-Min studied her face, round cheeks, set jaw, eyes completely steady behind their ridiculous plastic frames. He noticed she was trembling slightly, not her face, her hands. She was terrified. She was absolutely, completely terrified, and she was standing her ground anyway. He had not seen that in a very long time. Lumi spoke again. Same tone, same calm. Did he or did he not call my mom fat and ugly? Somewhere behind Kang Jae-Min, a sound occurred, a very small sound, suspiciously like a cough that wasn't a cough, from a bodyguard who had suddenly found the ceiling extremely interesting. Director Hwang Dae-Shuk recovered first. He had to. The silence was eating him. He pushed his chair back and stood, smoothing his jacket with the careful movement of a man reasserting dignity he no longer had. Chairman Kang, his voice was controlled, practiced. I apologize for the disturbance. It's just a child. She doesn't understand the situation. Lumi didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Kang Jae-Min. He said she doesn't understand, she noted. Still factual, still calm. I understand perfectly. Hwang's jaw tightened. Ah, kid. His voice dropped to the kind of low that's supposed to frighten. Adults are talking. Lumi finally looked at him and said the sentence. You're not an adult. A pause. 1 beat. 2. You're a bully with a big chair. The room stopped again. Hwang's face went through 4 different colors in 2 seconds. He laughed. A short, hard sound that was supposed to be dismissive and came out cracked at the edges. Chairman, be quiet. 2 words. Kang Jae-Min's voice. Not loud, not sharp. Just final. Hwang closed his mouth. Kang Jae-Min looked at him for one long moment. The kind of moment that in this world meant something specific and expensive. And then looked back at Lumi. He crouched, slowly, unhurried, deliberately bringing himself to her level. And up close. The child was even smaller than she'd looked from across the room. 6 years old and barely reaching his knee when he was standing. curly hair that someone had clearly attempted to tame and which had clearly won the argument. A small scratch on her chin that was probably a week old. Knuckles slightly red from how hard she'd been pressing her fists together. Still trembling, still standing. He looked at the glasses. Why no lenses? It wasn't the question she expected. Her chin lifted slightly. They make me look smarter. Do they work? I'm standing here, aren't I? Three of the bodyguards found completely different sections of the ceiling to examine. Kang Jae-Min held her gaze. You're afraid, he said quietly. But you didn't run. Lumi considered this. Running wouldn't fix it. No, he said. Arna, it wouldn't. He glanced at Sola briefly, took in the cleaned uniform, the tired eyes, the way she was standing slightly in front of her daughter even while trying to pull her back. Then he looked at Lumi again. Why are you angry? The question seemed to surprise her, like she'd expected a threat and received a math problem instead. Because you laughed, she said, when Huang said it. You laughed. Kang Jae-Min was still. The room was still, because she was right. He had laughed, not loudly, not cruelly. A small, involuntary sound at Huang's tone, the automatic response of someone used to being surrounded by men trying to impress him. He barely remembered doing it, but she had heard it, and she had counted it. Lumi took one step closer. Nobody in that room breathed. My mom works every day, she said. Her voice was still quiet, but it had changed texture. Still steady, but warmer now, like she'd moved from evidence to testimony. She wakes up before I do. Every day, even when she's sick, even when it's raining, even when... She paused and something crossed her face, too quick to catch. Even when she cried the night before. Sola made a small sound behind her. Lumi didn't stop. She takes the first bus. She's always cold at the stop because she gives me her scarf. And she never eats breakfast at home because she says she's not hungry, but I know she saves the food for me. She looked directly at Huang Daeshuk now. He was the only one still standing. Everyone else had gone very still in their chairs. The way people go still when they realize they've accidentally walked into something sacred. She does all of that, Lumi continued, and then she comes to your building and cleans your floors and picks up after you, and you look at her, and the only thing you see is something to make a joke about. Huang opened his mouth. Nothing came out. My mom isn't fat, Lumi said. She spread her arms wide. It was such a small gesture, such a completely unself-conscious, childlike motion. Arms out like she was demonstrating the size of a fish she'd caught. She's full. A confused silence. Lumi held the gesture. When she hugs me, there's enough of her to get all the way around me, and it feels like... She searched for the word with the focused expression of someone who takes words seriously. Like being inside a house. Like nothing cold can get in. The confused silence became something else entirely. Harder to name, harder to sit with. Some moms hug like they're scared to, Lumi said. Like they might break something. My mom hugs like she wants to make sure you know it's real. She lowered her arms, looked at Kang Jae-Min. So she's not ugly either. She's the safest place I know. 6 words. She's the safest place I know. The chandelier hummed softly above them. Somewhere outside, Busan Harbor moved in the dark. Kang Jae-Min had been in rooms where people begged for their lives. He had heard speeches from lawyers and senators and men who believed words could save them. He had negotiated across tables where billions moved like water. He had never felt a sentence land the way that one landed. Not in 20 years of building an empire. Not once. He stood slowly and turned to face Huang Daeshuk. One of the executives near the back quietly set his fork down on his plate with the careful movement of a man deciding he was no longer hungry and would not be for some time. Leave. One word. Kang Jae-Min didn't raise his voice, didn't point, didn't gesture toward the door or nod to his guards or do any of the things that in films signal that the moment has arrived. He simply said the word, and the word was enough. Huang Daeshuk blinked. Chairman, you insulted someone under my roof. Still the same flat, even tone. The tone of a man stating the temperature of the room. Completely factual, completely without heat, which was somehow much worse than shouting. When I wasn't aware she was... It doesn't matter who she was. Kang Jae-Min's eyes moved to his lead guard. That was all. No name called, no order given. Just a half second of eye contact. The guard moved, two others followed. Hwang Dae-seuk, who had arrived tonight in a car that cost more than most buildings in the city, who had shaken hands with 3 cabinet ministers in the last month, who genuinely believed himself to be a man consequence could not reach, was walked out of the banquet hall. Quickly, without ceremony, without his jacket, which was still on his chair, without his glass, which was still half full, without a single person at any table watching him go, because looking at him in that moment would have meant associating yourself with what he'd become, which was the most dangerous thing you could be in this room. A man Kang Jae-Min had already decided about. The doors closed. Silence held for a moment. Then Kang Jae-Min turned back to Lumi. The shift in the room was immediate and physical, like barometric pressure changing before rain. The danger didn't disappear. It never disappeared when he was present. But its direction had changed, moved away from the child, settled somewhere, undefined and manageable. People slowly remembered how to hold their cutlery. Lumi was watching the door. "Where is he going?" she asked. "Away," Kang Jae-Min said. She turned back to him. "Is he going to come back?" "No." She thought about this, nodded once, satisfied the way a judge looks satisfied when the right decision has been reached. Good. One of the executives coughed quietly into his napkin. It was the most human sound in the room. Sola had her hand pressed flat against her own chest, breathing slowly, processing the fact that they were both still standing here, that the evening had not ended the way every reasonable instinct she possessed had told her it was going to end. "Your name," Kang Jae-Min said. He was looking at Lumi. "Lumi Adiz." "And hers?" "My mom? She's Sola. Sola Adiz." He looked at Sola briefly. Something passed across his face. There and gone. Too fast to read. But it was something. "Adiz." He filed it quietly. "The glasses," he said, returning to Lumi. "You made them yourself?" "Found them," she corrected, "in a box outside a shop. They were already broken. I just made them useful. By wearing them. By deciding they were good." Another suspicious cough from somewhere behind him. Kang Jae-Min looked at her for one more long moment. Then he straightened, turned, and walked back to his table. The room exhaled. His name was Sergeant Bae Tae-wook. He had served as Kang Jae-Min's personal security lead for 11 years. He had stood in rooms while men confessed things. He had traveled on private planes to locations that did not appear on any official itinerary. He had, on 3 separate occasions, prevented assassination attempts with a reaction time faster than most people's thoughts. He was, by any reasonable measure, not a man who laughed easily. But standing 3 feet behind his employer in that banquet hall, while a 6-year-old girl in lensless glasses delivered what amounted to the most quietly devastating moral speech he'd heard in a decade, Tae-wook was fighting for his life. His face was doing the right things. Jaw set, eyes neutral. Body positioned correctly between his employer and the nearest point of entry. Everything technically perfect. His shoulders, however, were doing something entirely different. A small movement, barely visible. The kind a doctor might call an involuntary muscular response to suppressed respiratory effort. The kind everyone else in the world called trying not to laugh. Beside him, Officer Choi Ri-jun had developed a sudden and intense interest in the carpet pattern. Now, his entire upper body had tilted approximately 4 degrees away from the room, which didn't help as much as he'd hoped. The third guard, Officer Na Woo-bin, the youngest of the team, 26 years old, 6'2", trained in 3 forms of close combat, had taken the decisive action of turning to face the wall directly behind him on the grounds that he needed to check the perimeter of the service entrance. There was no threat at the service entrance. There was only a 26-year-old man pressing his forearm against the wall and pressing his face into his forearm. Tae-wook had watched this job turn him into many things over 11 years. He had not expected it to turn him into this. A man in a designer suit silently screaming into his collar because a child called the most feared person in the Korean underworld to account for laughing at the wrong moment. "You laughed." She had said it like she was citing evidence in a case. "You laughed." And his employer, the architect of silence, the man who had looked at armed rivals without blinking, the man who had once sat across from a government investigator for 4 hours without changing his expression once, had gone still. Not the dangerous still, the other kind. The kind Tae-wook had only seen a handful of times in 11 years. The kind that meant something had landed. He got his shoulders under control by the time Kang Jae-Min turned back to the table. Mostly, the chairman seated himself, lifted his teacup, looked out at the harbor, said nothing. Tae-wook retook his position, squared up, rebuilt the professional wall. But behind the wall, in the part of him that was still just a person, something was happening that he wouldn't fully process until much later that night. He was thinking about his own mother. Note, this chapter covers the emotional peak of Lumi's full speech, expanding what was given in the outline into its full emotional weight. The thing about truth is that it doesn't need volume. Lumi Adiz had never been taught rhetoric. She had never taken a class on persuasion or delivery or how to hold a room. She was 6 years old and had spent most of her intellectual energy this year on geckos, the structural integrity of cardboard architecture, and why the moon looked different on different nights. But she had grown up watching her mother. That was the education. Every morning she watched Sola Adiz get up before the alarm, watched her stand at the small window of their apartment drinking water because they were out of coffee again and she refused to spend the money. Watched her iron a uniform that was slightly faded now, but still pressed sharp because Sola believed that how you showed up mattered even when nobody was watching. Lumi had cataloged all of it. Children do this, quietly, without being asked. They watch the person who is their entire world, and they build a case file in the back of their mind. And they add to it every day, and they don't know they're doing it until the moment someone says something that makes the whole file burst open at once. Hwang De-suk had opened the file. Standing in the middle of that marble floor, Lumi spoke from it. She talked about the bus stop, the cold mornings where her mother gave away her scarf and then didn't mention it, the breakfasts that were always enough for one person, and somehow Sola always managed not to be hungry. The evenings where Lumi would fall asleep to the sound of her mother moving carefully around their small apartment so as not to wake her, and the way that sound, quiet footsteps, the soft close of a cabinet door, was the safest sound she knew. She talked about the hugs. This was the part that did it, not because it was dramatic, not because it was designed to be, but because she said it simply, the way children say true things, without performance or self-consciousness. When she hugs me, there's enough of her to go all the way around, both arms, and she squeezes a little. Not hard, just enough. So you know she means it. She wasn't looking at anyone in particular now, just speaking. Some adults hug like they're saying hello. My mom hugs like she's saying, I've got you, I've got you, I've got you. 3 times, because that was how it felt. At one of the center tables, a woman who managed shipping contracts for 3 major port companies found that she needed to look at something other than this child immediately, or something unfortunate was going to happen to her mascara. She was not alone in this assessment. The room was not a room of soft people. These were executives and brokers, and people who moved money through systems that did not reward feeling. And they had arrived tonight prepared to network and perform and go home. None of them had prepared for this. The harbor was dark beyond the windows. Kang Jae-Min stood, for the first time in as long as anyone in that room could remember. And some of these people had known him for 15 years. He did not know immediately what to say. This was noticed, not loudly. Nobody pointed or gasped. People in this world were too careful for that. But it was noticed and filed, and later it would be discussed in careful voices over private calls, because the architect of silence not having an immediate response was an event with significance the way a change in weather patterns has significance. You took note. You tried to understand what it meant. Lumi was watching him, waiting, not for an apology, not specifically. She'd said what she came to say. Now she was just watching, the way she watched everything, with that particular quality of attention that felt like being accurately read. Kang Jae-Min turned to the hall. The room was very quiet. He didn't address them collectively, didn't make a speech, didn't perform anything. He simply turned toward Hwang De-suk's empty chair, looked at it briefly, and then looked at his guard. Make sure his company's pending shipping contract review is put on indefinite hold. A pause. And pull every compliance report from his last 3 years of port operations. He said it the way you say pick up milk or reschedule the call. Completely without drama. Completely without mercy. He turned back to Lumi. She was still looking at him. Head tilted. The lensless glasses had slid partially down her nose, and she pushed them back up with one finger in a gesture so unself-conscious and routine, it was almost unbearable to watch. He won't do it again, Kang Jae-Min said. To anyone, he added. Lumi seemed to consider this. What about the other people he said things to before? Kang Jae-Min looked at her. What other people? People like my mom, workers, cleaners, drivers. She gestured in a small arc that seemed to encompass invisible thousands. Men like that don't just do it once. This child was exhausting. He meant that in the way that a complicated problem is exhausting. Not unpleasant, just genuinely demanding. I'll look into it, he said. It was the first time in years he had offered accountability to a 6-year-old. My Sola was watching this exchange with an expression that no longer contained coherent emotion. She had moved past fear, past relief, past confusion, into some new country that didn't have a name yet, and from which she couldn't currently see the border. Her daughter nodded at the most powerful man in the Korean underworld. Okay, Lumi said, as if it were settled, as if she had simply delegated a task and was satisfied with the handoff. You should smile more, she added. And then she walked back to her mother, slipped her hand into hers and looked up at her. Can we go check on Biscuit? I'm worried about the rain. That night in the car going home, Lumi fell asleep in the back seat before they reached the bridge. She did this sometimes. Dropped completely, instantly, the way children can, eaten as if consciousness simply decided it was done, and closed up shop without warning. 1 minute talking, next minute gone. Sola drove in silence. Her hands on the wheel were steadier than she expected. She had spent most of the last 2 hours being afraid. Full body, bone-deep afraid. The kind that happens when you realize how completely powerless you are in a situation and how much depends on the goodwill of someone who owes you nothing. But her daughter had done that. That 6-year-old girl in the back seat with the useless glasses pushed up on top of her head, and the gecko she was worried about, and the cardboard house project waiting at home. That child had walked into the most dangerous room Sola had ever been in, and spoken the truth without permission and survived. More than survived. Changed the room. Sola pressed her lips together hard. The bridge lights moved over the windshield in long orange stripes. She thought about her mother, Mira Adiz, who had spent 30 years as a nurse and raised Sola alone after Sola's father left, and who had never once, not in any memory Sola could reach, been afraid of saying what was true. Who had told Sola more than once, the only power worth having is the power to look someone in the eye and tell them the truth. Everything else can be taken. Sola had thought it was just something her mother said. It had sounded like something her mother said. She looked in the rearview mirror at Lumi sleeping. It turned out it was something that got passed down. Meanwhile, 37 floors above the route Sola was driving home, Kang Jae-Min sat in his private office, jacket off, the jade ring on the table beside his hand. He had a glass of water he hadn't touched. He was thinking about a name. Adiz. The name knocked at the locked door in the back of his mind like someone who knew the house was occupied. Adiz. He'd filed it away when the girl first said it in the hall, pulled it out now and turned it over. The sound of it, the shape of it, Sola Adiz, Lumi Adiz. Adiz. He went to the window. Busan Harbor was black and glinting. The name was pulling something toward the surface of him that had been underwater for a very long time. There are things we bury, not because we forget them, because we need them to stay under, because the weight of them above the surface would change the shape of everything we built on top. Kang Jae-Min had buried exactly one memory with that kind of care. Anyway, he stood at the window for a long time. Then he sat, and he let it come up. 22 years earlier. He was 29 years old, not the chairman, not the architect, not any of the names that had accrued to him since. Just a young man with ambitious connections and extremely dangerous enemies, and a bullet wound in his left side that had been bleeding for 6 hours. He'd made a mistake. The specific nature of the mistake is less important than its consequence, which was, he was alone in a Busan alley at 2 in the morning, unable to stand fully upright, with two rival factions looking for him and nobody who could risk helping him. Nobody in his world anyway. A light turned on in a building above him. A window opened. A woman looked down. She was maybe 55. Careful eyes. A nurse's uniform half changed from a late shift. The kind of face that assessed situations quickly and acted on what it found without spending unnecessary time on reaction. She looked at him for about 3 seconds. Then she said, "Can you get to the fire stairs?" That was it. No hesitation, no questions, no calculation of what this might cost her. Just, "Can you get to the fire stairs?" Her name was Mira Adiz. She was a district hospital nurse who lived in that building and had looked out a window at the wrong time and chosen to act anyway. She hid him for 4 days, changed his dressing twice a day without being asked, brought him food, gave him the smaller of her 2 blankets and kept the thinner one for herself, which he didn't discover until the 3rd morning and which bothered him more than the bullet wound. However, she never asked who he was. She probably knew. She had lived in that district her whole life. She was not naive about the men who moved through it. She helped him anyway. When he was well enough to go, he tried to give her money. She refused. He tried again. She refused again. He asked what she wanted. "Nothing," she said. "Just survive, and maybe be less of an idiot in the future." He had tried to find her afterward, twice. Both times he was redirected away by obligations and growth and the machinery of becoming something larger and more consuming. She had, without his realizing it, become one of those things you intend to return to that quietly stops being possible. Now he was sitting in a tower overlooking the same harbor, and a child with her eyes had just stood in his hall. 3 days later. Not a public investigation, not formal, nothing that would surface on any document trail or get discussed in any meeting. Just Tae-wook, trusted with a name and told to be thorough. The file landed on Kang Jae-Min's desk that Thursday afternoon. Subject, Lumi Adiz, age 30. He read it slowly. Immigrant, arrived from a port city 7 years ago, shortly before Lumi was born. Single parent, no family support network local. Rented a small apartment in a district known for affordable housing and long commutes. Currently employed as a contracted cleaner across 3 buildings, this tower being one. No criminal record, no significant financial assets, no debt beyond the standard weight of a person living at the exact margin of what is manageable, which in its own way tells a complete story about a life. He read the personal details, and then his eyes stopped moving. At the bottom of the secondary notes page, where Tae-wook had compiled family background. Father deceased, cause cardiac event 18 years prior. Mother, Mira Adiz, former district hospital nurse. Mother, deceased, 2 years prior, cause illness, 6-month progression. Kang Jae-Min read the name again. Mira Adiz. He set the file down, picked it up, read the name again. Mira Adiz. He stood from his desk, walked to the window, stood there for a while. The harbor was doing what it always did, indifferent, moving, entirely unconcerned with the things people carried. He thought about 4 days in a back bedroom in a district apartment, a woman who asked nothing and gave him what he needed without performing it as generosity. At a thinner blanket she kept without mentioning, "Just survive." He picked up the file again. Looked at the photograph of Sola that Tae-wook had pulled from the building's employee records. Looked at it carefully. She had her mother's hands. He hadn't noticed that in the hall. The same square, capable, unsentimental hands that had changed dressings without flinching and passed food through a gap in a door. He closed the file, sat for a very long time in the quiet office. Then he called Tae-wook. "Pull a full picture of the child's school situation," he said, "and the mother's employment contract." A pause. "Quietly," he added. Tae-wook said nothing, which was how Tae-wook confirmed he understood. He had a principle. When one of the few that had survived 22 years of building an empire and becoming the kind of man who could tell a room full of powerful people what to do with a teacup. Every debt gets paid, not from sentimentality, not from some code of honor, from something practical and cold. Because in the world he moved through, debts were infrastructure. Debts were the invisible architecture under the visible city. A debt unpaid was a weak point, a structural crack. He had debts he'd paid to people who deserved nothing from him simply because the ledger required it, and one debt he had never paid, to the only person who had helped him before he was worth helping. Mira Adiz had not hidden a powerful man. She had hidden a wounded nobody in an alley. A young man bleeding in the dark whom she had no reason to trust and every practical reason to ignore. She'd helped him anyway, and he had risen and risen and risen, and the world had reshaped itself around him, and the debt had stayed there, alive, accruing interest, in the locked room at the back of him. Mira was dead now. You cannot pay a debt to someone who is gone, but you can pay it forward. You can look at what she left behind. A daughter who raised a granddaughter alone, who woke up before dawn and gave away her scarf at the bus stop, and somehow produced a child with that same absolute refusal to be afraid of truth. And you can decide that the ledger doesn't have to stay open. It wasn't a sentimental decision. Kang Jae-Min didn't make sentimental decisions. It was a practical one. Well, he owed a debt to a woman who was gone, and the debt had to go somewhere, and it was going to go to the people she left behind. That was the accounting. What happened in his chest when he made that decision? The loosening of something that had been tight for longer than he'd realized. He filed under irrelevant and moved on. But it was there. He called Taewook again. Her schedule at the building, he said. What does it look like? Taewook told him. Adjust it. Better hours, better routes. Don't explain it to her as anything other than a staffing change. A pause. And the pay structure. Another pause. Fix it. The meeting was quiet. 3 weeks after the banquet. A different room in the building. Smaller, no chandelier. No view designed to crush people. An office that functioned as a neutral space, name which in his world meant a space nobody had reason to fear. He'd asked to see Sola privately. She came in the way people always came in when summoned by him. Composed on the surface, white-knuckled underneath. Wearing the same pressed uniform. Same square, capable hands. She sat across from him. He offered tea. She accepted because refusing would have been strange, and this woman was clearly too smart to create unnecessary strangeness. He waited until she'd taken one sip. Then he said, Your mother, Mira Adiz. The cup stopped halfway to its second trip. Very slowly, Sola set it down. You knew her, he said. It wasn't a question. She was my mother. Her voice was careful. How do you know that name, he told her. Not everything. Not the full biography of what he was before he was this, but enough. The alley. Out of the 4 days. The dressing changes and the thinner blanket and the refusal of payment and the last instructions she'd given him that he had now carried for more than 2 decades without repaying. Sola listened without interrupting. When he finished, the room held it for a moment. She looked at the table. Her jaw was doing the same thing Lumi's jaw had done in the banquet hall. That controlled, deliberate not crumbling. The family expression for keeping something together while being moved. She never told me, Sola said. She wouldn't have, he said, and he said it with certainty because it was exactly the thing Mira Adiz would not have done. You didn't help someone and then make a story out of it. You just helped. You moved on. She died 2 years ago, Sola said. I know. I'm sorry. She looked up at him. The directness of her gaze reminded him forcibly that she was Mira's daughter. Lumi's father, he said. Is he? Gone, Sola said. Before she was born. Quiet. He nodded once, looked at the file on his desk. Your daughter, he said. A pause. She's extraordinary. Sola's expression did something complicated. Not proud exactly, or not only proud. Exhausted and proud and slightly terrified of the specific way in which her daughter was extraordinary, which was the way that put you in front of powerful men in banquet halls and expected them to answer. She gets it from her grandmother, Sola said. He had stood there in the hall and watched her refuse to move. He had watched a 6-year-old girl decide that the size of a person was not relevant information. And something had moved in him that he had not felt in a very long time. Not softness. He would not have called it that. Recognition. because there was a version of him, buried now, barely retrievable, somewhere beneath the empire and the marble floors and the decisions that couldn't be undone. Who had looked at power the same way? Not with awe, with question. Why? Who decided? What gives you the right? He had started with those questions, and somewhere in the process of getting answers, he had become one of the things the questions were about. That was, he understood now, how it usually went. But watching Lumi stand in that hall, the questions came back, not as regret, not as guilt. He wasn't built for guilt in the simple way, and he knew it, and he didn't pretend otherwise, just as clarity. The child had stood there and told the truth without calculating whether she was allowed to. And the truth she'd told was small and specific and completely without ego. Not I am important, but my mother is important. Not look at me, but look at her. That was the thing. It wasn't courage on behalf of herself. It was courage on behalf of someone she loved. That specific kind of courage, the kind that doesn't come from ambition or strategy, but from a bone-level refusal to watch someone you love be dismissed, was the rarest thing he'd encountered in his world. He had also last seen it 22 years ago, in a woman with a thinner blanket who helped a stranger bleed in the dark. The decision not to stop Lumi in the hall had not been made after weighing options. It had not been strategy. He had stood there and watched her, and something in him had made a decision before his logic caught up to it. The logic only came later. The logic was, you do not stop that. You don't stop truth that size. You step back and let it do what it came to do. It started quietly, the way he did everything. Sola arrived for her shift one Tuesday to find that her schedule had been adjusted. Earlier start, better building rotation, finished by 9 instead of midnight. The supervisor said it was a staffing reshuffle. Sola accepted it. The pay review came 3 weeks later. Retroactive. She called her supervisor to ask if there'd been an error. The supervisor said there'd been a contract correction to align her rate with the standard tier. Sola accepted this too. She was too tired and too busy and too relieved to interrogate good fortune. She didn't know. She would have refused it if it were offered directly. He understood this because he had understood her mother, who had also refused direct offerings with the firm patience of someone who had thought through what accepting meant and made a deliberate choice. So he didn't offer. He adjusted. Lumi's school situation was more delicate. The building where she attended primary classes was decent but under-resourced. The after-school program she needed to cover the hours between Sola's shifts cost money that technically was available, but practically required gymnastics to manage. The gymnastics disappeared. A small endowment arrived at the school from an anonymous donor. He had several shell structures designed precisely for legitimate uses, exactly like this one, designated for student support services. Lumi's support fees were covered. Sola received a letter explaining she had qualified for a community assistance program she had not heard of and did not fully understand, but which appeared legitimate and was therefore, again, accepted. She didn't know. Tae-wook was tracking it, checking in quarterly. Not on Lumi or Sola as subjects of surveillance. He had been very specific about this. But checking that the adjustments were holding and that nothing had surfaced to reverse them. He did this because the architect of silence had said one sentence to him, quietly in the car after the first file review. Make sure nothing touches them. And Tae-wook, who had served this man for 11 years and knew the difference between every kind of instruction he gave, filed this one under permanent. She came in with her mother on a Thursday afternoon. It was a routine shift, nothing special. No event in the upper floors. Lumi had been promised she could wait in the lobby with her gecko. She'd brought the gecko in a ventilated box, which she had decorated with stickers, while Sola did a cleaning rotation in the lower offices. Tae-wook saw her first from the security desk. He activated his earpiece. "The child is in the lobby," he said. A pause. "Which child?" came the reply. As if there were multiple children who regularly disrupted this building. "The glasses child," Tae-wook said. Silence on the line. "Howdy, I'll come down," said Kang Jae-Min. Tae-wook kept his face completely neutral and said, "Understood, sir." Lumi was sitting cross-legged on the lobby bench with the gecko box on her knees, explaining something to Biscuit through the air holes. The explanation seemed to involve the lobby's fountain, which Lumi found architecturally interesting and had been detailing at length to a gecko who appeared unmoved. She heard the elevator, looked up, saw him. "Hey!" The security staff at the front desk experienced a collective response that was almost entirely professional. She hopped off the bench. The gecko box bounced, but she kept it level, and crossed the lobby with the specific walk of a small child who is in a hurry and does not consider any space too important for hurrying in. "Did you fix the contract stuff?" and she asked. He had come downstairs without fully knowing why and was not prepared for this opening. "What contract?" "For the workers. You said you'd look into it." He had said that. He had also, in fact, acted on it, having done a quiet review of the building's contracted cleaning staff pay tiers and renegotiated 2 of them upward. But he had said it offhandedly to a child in the middle of a crisis evening and had not expected her to remember it in exact detail 3 weeks later. "It's being addressed," he said. She looked at him, evaluating. "Okay," she said, satisfied again. She held up the box. "Do you want to see Biscuit?" He looked at the gecko. The gecko looked back at him with the profound indifference of a creature unconcerned with underworld reputation. "And you should smile more," Lumi said. "You look like the building." He went back upstairs, stood at the window, thought about the gecko, which had looked at him with more straightforward honesty than most humans had managed in a decade. He thought about what it meant that a 6-year-old checked up on whether he'd kept his word, tracked it, remembered the exact phrasing, and returned to verify the outcome. Not to confront, to confirm. There was a difference. Confrontation was about power. Confirmation was about expectation. She expected him to follow through, not feared it, not hoped for it, expected it. As if the possibility that he might not was simply not in her model of how things worked. He had spent 22 years building a world that operated on fear. Fear as infrastructure. Fear as guarantee. Because in his experience it was the most reliable mechanism. More reliable than loyalty, which could be bought away. More reliable than love, which could be extinguished. More reliable than law, which could be navigated. Fear held. He believed this. He still believed this. But standing at the window with the harbor doing its indifferent thing below him, he was forced to notice something. He had kept his word about the workers' contracts. Not because Lumi could do anything to him if he didn't. Not because he feared what would happen, but because she expected it. And somewhere between the banquet hall and the lobby, her expectation had become a thing he was unwilling to disappoint. That was not a mechanism he had a name for. It was not fear. It was not strategy. It was not even the ledger of the debt to Mira. Anna, though that was part of it. It was something smaller and more inconvenient. He had looked at a 6-year-old who looked at him like he was still capable of being the man who didn't exist yet. The one who hadn't made the choices, hadn't built the architecture, hadn't decided that silence was the safest structure. And for a moment he'd seen himself through her eyes. Not the architect, not the chairman. Just a person in a lobby who a child thought should smile more. The last time someone had seen him as just a person had been in a district apartment with a nurse and a thinner blanket. He stood at the window for a long time. Then he sat down at his desk and signed 3 documents. The third one was new, drafted quietly, kept sealed. Something he had decided was necessary. Months passed. The tower kept turning. The harbor kept moving. The world Kang Jae-Min had built kept running through its systems and structures without needing him to hold it up every moment, which was the whole point of an empire. That it functions whether or not the architect is watching. Lumi turned 7. She visited the building 3 more times. Each time she checked on the workers. Each time she told him something direct and completely unnecessary and completely correct. That his waiting area needed a plant. That the security team looked tired in their eyes and should maybe have a different job. That Biscuit had shed his skin, and it was, in her words, extremely cool and also a little disgusting. Sola stopped looking afraid when she entered the building. Not comfortable. She was too intelligent to be fully comfortable here, and he respected that, but not afraid. There is a difference between a person who has put their fear away because they have assessed the situation accurately and a person who simply doesn't know enough to be afraid. Sola knew. She had chosen to be present anyway. Again, Mira's daughter. In November, a sealed legal document was filed through a legitimate firm that handled several of his above-ground holdings. It was not a dramatic document. It was not long. Legal instruments rarely need to be long to be significant. It specified that in the event of his death or incapacitation, 50% of his legitimate holdings, the shipping infrastructure, the clean properties, the registered investment structures that had no blood on them, would pass to a trust. The trust had one beneficiary, not a general, not a partner. Not a political connection or a family member or any of the people who had been quietly calculating their position in his eventual succession for the last decade and would have been humiliated to know the answer. A 7-year-old girl, Lumi Adiz. His legal team had asked, with the practiced neutrality of people paid to not react, whether there was a relationship to be documented. He had thought about how to answer. Her grandmother saved my life, and he said, and her mother is raising something that the world should not be allowed to ruin. The document was filed. The world didn't know. The underworld didn't know. Sola didn't know. And Lumi didn't know, which was correct, because 7-year-olds should not know the weight of the things that have been placed quietly in their name. Us, that's what the years between now and then were for. In the lobby of the Obsidian Tower on a Thursday in November, a small girl sat cross-legged on a bench with a ventilated box on her knees, telling her gecko about the fountain. She pushed her lensless glasses up her nose. She was not afraid of anything. She did not know she was the only person in the world the architect of silence fully trusted. She didn't need to know. She was already being exactly who she was. That was the whole point. End.